Alex Levy of Atmo.ai. It's great to see you, Alex. Thanks for coming by. We were talking before we turned the recorders on that you're just seeing a tremendously large amount of new use cases for things that maybe we thought we had solutions for. What's that look like from your perspective on the floor of the show?
Well, at Atmo, we predict the weather with AI, and we do it for governments and militaries around the world. And what we're finding consistently is that people want to do two kinds of things. They want to up the level of quality and detail in their forecasts substantially, and they want to apply it to all sorts of interesting use cases in conflict situations. So in terms of resolution and accuracy, the kind of forecast that you'd get in a weather forecasting app or from the National Weather Service, or even for what a lot of military offices do, has a relatively low resolution. It might divide the world into chunks of 20 miles by 20 miles or 10 miles by 10 miles. But actually for combatant commanders in the field, the kind of information that they need in order to route personnel, vehicles, to make maneuvers, to know what's going to happen, has to be much more precise than that. And so for Atmo, we've been bringing that resolution up more than 100 times to as little as 1,000 feet by 1,000 feet by 5-minute resolution. And so the kind of use cases that people are honing in on are things like the use of that for drone flight planning. So there are now thousands of drone missions a day around the world by many different armed forces. And weather is a big risk factor to the success or failure of those missions. So you need to precisely avoid areas of turbulence, for example. Another example would be heavy armored vehicles. Think about the current conflict in Ukraine, for instance, where the Ukrainians have done a good business in making sure that enemy forces are routed into unfavorable conditions, muddy conditions, whilst all the heavy armored vehicles that our allies are donating are routing to areas that are passable and maneuverable. That's another case. And then the most recent one that we heard of recently, just here at this event, relates to jumpers. So people that are paratroopers that are dropping in, they have to hit their marks on precise landing zones. They get a briefing when they go up as to the weather they can expect. But it's often inaccurate and it's often very low resolution. So they can wind up miles away from their target zone, which can be quite dangerous. And so for them, what they would want to be able to do is ultra-precise on-demand forecasting. So those are sort of three of the cases that we often see from commanders and operators.
The middle one is fascinating to me. They're all cool, but the middle one is fascinating to me because I had not thought of weather and the use of the data that comes from it as both an offensive and defensive capability. Exactly. Providing information to somebody else that might not be accurate to get them literally stuck in the mud, it sounds like.
Exactly. No, that's exactly right. Through the history of conflict, commanders have really tried to use weather conditions both offensively and defensively. Offensively for covering or for freedom of movement, defensively essentially to create a barrier or a risk to enemy forces. And so the way that you can do that is if you know what's going to happen in advance. So if I know, at a date certain, time certain, location certain, that you're going to have an extremely bad inclement condition, I want you as an enemy as much as possible to wind up there at that time and place. So if I have the freedom to route you to that, knowing that that's going to be a bad situation for you, that's great. That's a weapon in itself. And so commanders really like to use that information. Historically, though, they've been limited by how much they can trust the forecast, how accurate it is, how precise it is. So, with Atmo, our ability to bring up the accuracy and resolution using AI techniques for the atmosphere allows that to be much more practical. So now it's not just thinking of an entire province's weather, entire state's weather, but really honing down to a city block by a city block, or one street or road versus another, one field versus another. That takes that tactical use case to a much more granular level.
Yeah. I don't expect you to go into too much detail and give the secrets away, but
sure.
What does AI add to that equation, add to that stew that allows you to slice it that thinly?
Yeah, well, there's two things. AI models have incredible advantages in terms of computational performance. So they have in recent years been able to learn complex tasks and then to produce predictions very, very efficiently. And so what that means is if you can do it efficiently, you can then dial up all sorts of characteristics. So you can dial up the resolution. You can say, I'm going to go from a 10-mile one, I'm going to multiply this by 100 times the detail. If your algorithm is efficient enough, you can do that in the same resource constraint that you had before. Same processor, but 100 times the detail. That's one. The second is about accuracy. So classical forecasting is not machine learning based, which means if you predict something about the weather and you're wrong, the forecast you're using, that fixed forecast, will make the same mistake the same way every time. A machine learning based forecast takes in the measurements from the field continuously, compares them to what was predicted, and then issues millions of daily corrections all across its prediction area. And so that means that when you set up in a new zone of conflict, you can expect using an AI system to have that accuracy go up and up and up, which means that you can rely on the predictions much more strongly than the traditional non-AI based way of doing it.
And I imagine the longer you collect data and the more data you collect, the algos just become more and more refined over time.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
It's great to talk to you, Alex. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you very much.